So, John, I don't know if you've seen any of the new resurrected version of the podcast or not, but the way it usually goes is uh, we kind of are on screen for a second, and then Aaron plays the catchiest theme music in all of podcasting. Hello, MC Podcast audience. Thanks for coming back to another episode. We got my dad. I'm Andrew Crabtree. This is my dad, Lynn Crabtree.
Hi there.
And joined off the screen here is our friend John Gaser. John, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Good day, guys. I look forward to entering into some good discussion and hopefully helping our viewers out there make some good decisions in the near future.
Well, near future is right, because we're going to talk about silage harvest to kick things off. And by the time this airs here in a couple weeks, we'll be knocking on the door of cutting some silage. As we're kind of trying to give some knowledge here that can help our friends watching. I think you kind of gave a talk to some of our dealers via Zoom a few weeks ago, and one of the things that you were talking about that kind of stood out to me as an ideal topic for this time of year was harvest moisture. So maybe if you want to just riff for a minute on what's the ideal harvest moisture, and then what can you lose if you miss that window?
Yeah, I can't do it. So I've seen a few articles trying to hit this point recently, notably from Professor Joe Lauer, University of Wisconsin. I've had opportunity to learn from him. Professor Randy Shaver and some other key industry influencers out there. But if we miss and we go out and cut corn and we miss our moisture window, it's going to have potentially two ramifications for us downstream, feeding that silage out later. We typically monitor moisture as a proxy for maturity, the whole plant maturity. And so that's important to nail, so that we have an appropriate balance of starch and grain content relative to the stover, but also so that we optimize the grain and stover digestibility. Because if the maturity gets on a little bit too far, we'll end up with a little bit harder starch, a little bit more vitreous endosperm, and it's just not going to feed as well. It's going to flow through cows, through cattle, and unfortunately, we're going to leave some bushels on the table that we'll be feeding back to turkeys. But where moisture is equally or even more important to pay attention to, as well as kernel maturity and whole plant maturity, because there can be disconnects between moisture and maturity. So it's important to monitor both kernel maturity, whole plant maturity, as well as moisture. But moisture relates to how successfully we can preserve the whole plant chopped corn and create silage. There are a few important factors to creating a successful silage, one that can be stored for 3 weeks to 3 months to even 3 years. I've been exposed to silage that has been fermented and sealed up and preserved for a decade plus. And at the day it comes out, it's still as good as, say, 3 months to a year after it would have went in. But if we miss our moisture window, then we're going to have a little bit more likelihood for a little bit fluffier feed in the silo or in the bag or in the bunker, pile, pit, whatever we might call it. I'll use the term silo to classify all of them. And if we end up with that fluffy scenario, then we're going to have a situation where air can get in a little bit more to the silage when we're feeding it back out, which presents some feed out stability and nutrient loss issues. We can have nutrient robbers like mold and yeast grow in the feed, and we might pitch off some spoiled feed that we think we kind of took care of things and cleaned the feed up, but there's a lot going on that we won't be able to see with our eyeballs. So coming back to your question and pointing out why moisture is so important to monitor and get somewhere probably around 62 to 68% on average, depending on your storage structure, around 35 dry matter. We got to nail that so we can successfully preserve, ferment, and capture every bit of nutritional value out of every acre we harvest and feed that out.
Very cool. So one of the other factors, as guys are going in and they're cutting silage, talk maybe, and maybe you can chime in after him, talk about chop length and chop height. What do you like to see? And then, at Master's Choice, and maybe you can kind of address this a little bit too, is at Master's Choice, having that flex plant and having more of that plant digestible, how maybe your chop height can be affected by the genetics you're working with.
Yeah, so I'm going to put my university hat on just for a second and say it depends, right? The chop length and then the cut height are going to depend upon other factors. But thinking practically, where a lot of our dairy and beef producers are at and growers for those different farms. Depending on how much silage we have in the diet, the chop height and cut length, theoretical cut length, are increasingly important to balance against other factors. So I'll start by the situation where it really doesn't matter, and there are very few of these out there. But if we're feeding, say, 2/3 or most of our forage is a hay or a haylage crop, well, then the chop length and the cut height of the corn and the whole plant corn silage isn't going to be as influential on the resulting diet performance. It'll matter to some extent, but it's not going to be as important because we're going to have fiber, effective fiber that's important for rumen function and animal health coming from other areas. But more increasingly common with today's dairy and beef feed yard situations, we are feeding more and more and more silage. It tends to give us more digestible total carbohydrate combination of grain and stover per acre at a lower cost. It's a more consistent crop relative to our hay and haylage crop. So what we are seeing is just higher silage diet. So with those higher silage diets, and provided that we've got a fair bit of forage in the diet, depending on dairy and beef, it might be as low as 20% forage, or it might be upwards of 60 to 70% forage. I'll speak about theoretical length of cut first. That is really important to nail down, because if we, and I will assume most producers out there will be kernel processing. In the event that we are not kernel processing, well, then it's a little bit more important to chop a little bit finer. But in the event that we are kernel processing, then we're going to want to lengthen out our theoretical length of cut to probably somewhere between 3/4 of an inch and an inch plus. Speaking in English units, from a metric standpoint, probably somewhere in around 19 to 26 millimeters, if I'm remembering my conversion right. But that's going to be important so that we have enough effective fiber in the diet, we can maintain rumen health, and that the silage doesn't flow through the animals too quickly where we lose feed efficiency. Feed efficiency should be something that we are using as one of our key performance indicators now, just beyond say gains without taking into account intake or just milk production per cow per day. We got to be talking feed efficiency, which is going to tie back more tightly to economics and business performance. But then coming back to cut height in my mind will depend upon more so yield and what the growing conditions have done for us in the given year, and what our silage inventory currently looks like. So in years where we just didn't have good yields the year prior, or we may have had drought or tough conditions, which many producers in the upper Midwest and Northeast have experienced over the last couple of years, we don't necessarily have mammoth feed inventories or big carryover. So in that case, I would more likely recommend cutting at traditional chop heights. So that would be anywhere between as low as 4, 5, 6 inches off the ground and maybe 8 to 12 inches off the ground. But if we have a fantastic growing year, such as many of us experienced this year, as well as reasonable to above average feed inventories, then we can consider raising the cutter head up on the chopper a good 6, 12, or even 18 inches. And what that's primarily going to do is increase the grain to stover ratio. So we're going to end up with a higher starch content. We're going to end up with more energy per pound and per ton of feed, which will be to the dairy or feed yard's benefit, because we've got just greater energy density with every mouthful of feed consumed. And then we will also be leaving a less digestible portion of the plant in the undigestible neutral detergent fiber, or UNDF 240 as us nutritionist geeks call that. It tends to concentrate a little bit more the closer we get to the ground. So if we leave that bottom part of the stover out in the field, that means that we have a more digestible fiber as well. Professor Luis Ferretto and I have done some work looking at several different publications out there, and we've come up with some calculations to look at cut height relative to yield. Of course, if we cut higher, we will be leaving some yield out in the field, but it's less digestible yield. But it will also improve not only grain to stover, but also the digestibility of the fiber in that plant. So those are all important considerations. I've sort of rambled quite a bit here, but hopefully you can fold some of these thoughts into your decision-making process this year.
John, I've got a theory that I want to run by you, and it's kind of connecting some dots, but it originates in, and I really want to know what you think about this, and I probably should ask you before we went into this podcast what your opinion is, so I don't set myself up for failure. But we have really, and this is a shameless plug for Master's Choice, but we have really designed our development program, our R&D research behind trying to reduce populations and breed for high sugar contents. And the reason that we've done that is because my theory suggests that a lot of the things that we're doing that are detrimental to our cause have been in place because we have a poorly designed product for its end use. And what I mean by that is that when we're talking about moisture content, we have constantly pushed that 35 to 40% dry matter mark down to closer to 30 to 35%. Much more recommendations out there for a lot less moisture. When we do that, we reduce yield. When we get closer to black layer, yields go up. And in a lot of cases, we can reduce yield by 20% when we're chopping at 32% dry matter versus 38% dry matter. So it's important to try to be able to hit that upper end if we can without giving up some of the issues that you talked about that's going to cause us some harm. So with a lower population, we're able to get a lot more density in the stalk, a little more digestibility in those 5 carbon sugars that are in that stalk, and that's the kind of material that packs better. So the issue that you had on hand where we are not getting good pack with that fluff and fermentation loss, which you didn't discuss either, which can be significant, 12, 15, 20% loss in terms of dry matter and nutrients in our silage can be traced back to, in my opinion, placing a Band-Aid on an ill-conceived product. I believe that we need to lower populations while still trying to achieve yield. You do that with flex genetics. You get that material that is going to pack better. It's adequate fermentation. We can chop longer instead of finer grind. We can begin to alleviate some of those concerns that we have with the product that's a little better conceived. So that's kind of a theory that I've got, that a lot of the issues that we've got with processors, high chop length, wetter moistures, can really be traced back to us pushing populations higher and getting the corn plant itself farther away from what would be ideal for proper fermentation and maximizing yield and maximizing effective fiber and nutrition in the rumen. Make sense?
Yeah, you hit on. I appreciate you bringing back the fermentation of dry matter losses. This is an area I've done a little bit of academic research as well as have a fair bit of practical experience to go along with it. So when I speak of moisture or dry matter targets, it's coming back to exactly what you pointed out, the fermentation losses and the risk associated with those. So you're right, Lynn. In the event that we can do everything right, nail all our check boxes and our management to-do list as we set out and plan for the year with our harvesting crew, getting a crop in at 36, 37, 38% dry matter will tend to be a greater starch content, and we will certainly have greater yield associated with that. Where I'm a little bit more conservative on my dry matter recommendations or moisture recommendations, it stems from too many experiences where we have aimed for that goal, but we have missed our window, and then a plant that dries out or crops that dries out very quickly, and then the risk associated with that side of the equation is just too much, and we end up burned with 12 to 18 months of feed that is nowhere near what we want it to be. Despite having decent nutritional profile, it's just not coming in, and it's not a decent silage. So it's a little bit of a risk game as well. But back to your point on fermentation losses, I appreciate that, because you're right, I glossed over that, and I'll gloss over a lot of things for those of you that which is not my intention. I tend to get on tangents. But speaking to that fermentation shrink, when we talk about 12 to 15% fermentation losses, Lynn is exactly correct. And I'll phrase it in another way. Think about going out and harvesting an acre or harvesting 100 acres. So a typical silage yield is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 tons of wet or as-is feed. Think about harvesting, putting the seed in the ground, paying for that high-quality seed genetics, doing all that we can in management, agronomic management, soil fertility throughout the season. Lynn is exactly right. A lighter population does look to be of nutritional benefit from a silage standpoint, so that's something we got to consider. But then harvesting that crop, storing that crop, and say having, maybe in the neighborhood of $800 in cost of production for that acre, and say 25-ton yield. Then think about taking 15% of that crop and that acre and just lighting on fire. That's essentially what fermentation losses are. And the best areas, they're able to minimize that down to probably 2 to 5%. When we do everything right, we have a successfully fermented feed. If we harvest, say, 30 ton, we're going to feed out 97 to 98% of that 30 ton, and that's minimal dry matter loss. But in the event that we miss our window, we don't do a good job in hitting all of our management checklists, and we end up with 7 to 10 to even 15% in fermentation losses, think about losing, I don't know, 3 to 5 ton of that 30 ton you harvested, and it's just disappearing. That's what we're talking about here. It's a substantial economic impact that we don't necessarily see, but that disappears over the life of fermentation and feed out.
Well said.
Very cool. So we kind of covered the topics that we kind of emailed about before the show, but as we said, silage harvest is coming up. It's soon. Is there anything else that you can think of? Maybe this as we're sending our guys out to the chopper, like, what else would you maybe want to impart to them?
Yeah, first and foremost, be safe. Be safe through this time. It's been just a wild year to this point, and so we have wished one another safety for very different reasons many times over. But as we get out and we're around large machinery and equipment, just please be safe, wear bright colored outfits, and look out for one another. And then when it comes to us just conducting ourselves this year, one thing that we were discussing prior to the podcast, but I think dairies and feed yards out there in evaluating seed genetics into the future stand to have some substantial opportunity in better evaluating seed genetics by way of maybe looking at how seed genetics perform on your farm in your growing conditions. So if there's any opportunity for you to maybe a little bit more intensely, evaluate some of your seed genetics grown on your farm this year. And of course, I'll put in a shameless plug for doing some nutrition profile testing. Many of you know that by day I work with and support Rock River Laboratory and enjoy that relationship, working with Master's Choice through that channel as well. But getting an idea of how the seed genetics and hybrids perform on your farm, in your growing conditions, as well as what the well-replicated results look like with our impending test plot results coming from the Master's Choice team and others. But that would be one other thing I would suggest to consider.
Good. Very cool. You got anything you want to add to silage harvest?
I'm really kind of
tapped you out,
blew it up. Yeah.
Well, John, thanks for coming on. Let's do it again sometime soon.
I look forward to that, guys. I appreciate you offering me a platform to hopefully come out and help with a few tips, but keep up the great work.
Thank you. All right, podcast audience, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks, guys.